Have you ever wanted some tips on painting black and white armor schemes? How about some layering techniques for painting cloth, with maybe a little bit of non-metallic metals thrown in? Well, you're in luck, as today I'm going to be showing you step by step how I painted the core troops for the Shattered Empire, one of the main starting factions for Broken Anvil's brand new skirmish game, Rivenstone. The specific figures we're going to be painting today are the Wardens and the Patrol Runner, but these techniques should work great for any of the Wave 1 starting figures for the Shattered Empire. The only techniques I won't be covering in detail here are the Rivenstone glow effects, which we'll be tackling in a separate video as it's a technique that applies to all the factions in the game. To start out, I've gone ahead and assembled all the figures, given them some basing material, primed them in black, and then given them a quick overspray with a white primer. And if you'd like more detail on any of these steps, I would suggest you go and check out my separate video on how I do basing for skirmish games, linked down in the description. But if you're just starting out, a simple white primer and any basing material you like will do fine. With our basing and priming complete, let's get straight to the painting. And to begin, we're going to use a few contrast paints to make our job just a little bit easier. Starting out by giving all of the armor plates on our figures a liberal dose of Apothecary White. And if you've never used contrast paints before, I recommend you shake this paint 3 times as much as you need to, and then because it's Apothecary White, which can be the most persnickety of these colors, shake it even more than that. Once you've shaken it up, dip your brush into the pot, wipe off some of the excess, but not all of it, and then just start applying this color over all of the parts of the models that we want to be white. Our goal here is to apply this paint quickly before it has a chance to start drying. And don't worry about applying too much of it, as even if we apply a little bit too much or get this paint in places where we don't necessarily want it, it's such a light color that it's not going to matter very much because we can paint any of our other colors on top of it. You'll notice that's sort of a theme in this video. I'm going to be applying all of the lighter colors first and all of the darker colors towards the end of this tutorial so that we can paint over things if we need to. I mostly applied this color to the armor plates, but also just anywhere on the model that the key artist painted in white on the official artwork. They already did a lot of thinking about which colors should be where, so in my opinion, there's no need to mess around with some already great work. In fact, I stuck pretty close to the official color scheme for all of the paints in this video, except in cases where I wanted things to be just a little bit more saturated than the official color scheme. Once the Apothecary White is dry, you can really see the benefit of using this paint. It gives us some instant shading on all of our white armor, which is traditionally a pretty difficult thing to paint by hand. Next up, we're going to progress to the second lightest color in this scheme, Gryph-Charger Gray, which we'll be using to paint all of the parts of the model that we want to be a bright metallic silver. I applied this in a similar way that I did with the Apothecary White and laid it on really thick and liberally to any of the metal parts of the model. With this color, you can see I'm being a bit more careful and trying to guide it more into the recesses of the model. But again, this color is so light that if we make any mistakes here, we can easily paint over it at a later stage. And once we're done painting all of the metallic parts of the figure, it's time to move on to what I like to call accent color number 1. And depending on how you want your army to look, any bright saturated color would work well here. From a bright red or orange to a purple, greens, blues, really it's up to you how you want your army to look. But because I'm a fan of the official artwork and I want to stick pretty closely to that, I'm going to be using one of my new favorite contrast paints here, Pterodon Turquoise. In the official artwork, this color is used pretty sparsely and limited mostly to tabards and capes, but because I want my figures to look just a bit more colorful, I've opted to splash this color in a few more places on the model, including the gloves, the bedroll, as well as the bit right around the neckline on the armor. And once that's done, we can move on to painting the undersuits of the models, which in the official artwork are painted a slightly greenish brown color, but I have opted for a more vibrant, though still more desaturated look by mixing together equal parts Gryph-Charger Gray and Achelian Green. I have specifically chosen Achelian Green for this because it's an analogous color to our first accent color. And if you want to visualize it, it's right next to our first accent color on the color wheel. But because it's a little bit too bright, I made it just a bit less saturated so it doesn't overpower our first accent color by mixing in some Griftcharger Gray. So if you've chosen a different color for accent color number 1, I would suggest you do a similar thing here by choosing an analogous color on the color wheel. So for instance, if you chose a bright red for your first accent color, a slightly more purplish red or a slightly more orangish red would make a great second accent color. And once the undersuits of the models are completely painted, we can finally get to the fun part, painting all the fun little trim on the armor. And while this step requires a little bit more precision than previous steps, I also find it is one of my favorite parts of painting these models. So for this step, I want the armor trim to look black, but what we're actually going to be using here is a 50-50 mix of contrast black Templar and Griftcharger Gray. We're doing this to achieve a little bit of variation in the tone, and the way we're going to apply this is a little bit different than the contrast paints we've applied so far. Our goal here is going to be taking just a little bit of this paint on our brush and running our brush carefully along each curve of the armor, letting the majority of the paint seep into the deepest of crevices. This can take just a little bit of practice, but the contrast paint makes it a lot easier as it's designed for this sort of thing. And as the paint dries, you'll see exactly the effect we're going for, with the trim getting a nice gradient of dark to light. And at this point, we can also use this black color to fill in any areas we want to be in shadow on the figure, such as the holes in the visor, any creases that need a bit of shadow to them, and I also use this color to just add a little bit of shading to the undersuit on the figure, which turned out a little bit brighter than I intended with my first color. And once our black armor trim is complete, this is a great time to paint the bases on the figure. As I discussed in my basing tutorial for these figures, I used Parasite Brown here, slightly thinned down with water. And once I painted the entire base with this color, I also used this color to base coat all of the leather parts on the model. And one of the nice side effects of using this color to base coat the leather is that if we are a little bit imprecise or get it in places we don't necessarily want it, it's the same color as the base, so it's just going to look like a little bit of dirt from the ground has gotten onto the armor, which is never a bad thing. You'll also notice while I'm applying this color that I'm leaving certain parts of the leather trim unpainted, and you're going to see why I do this in the next step. But before we do that, I just would like to tell you a little bit about today's sponsor, Rivenstone. Rivenstone is a brand new skirmish game by my good friends over at Broken Anvil, and if you haven't noticed by my social media presence or my previous video on Rivenstone, I personally am really excited to paint up and play all of the factions for this game, as it's not just a new game, but also our introduction to a brand new fantasy world that will be expanded in multiple types of media going forward. As far as the gameplay itself, it's been designed by a ton of industry veterans and has been described as an alternating activation skirmish style game with about 8 to 15 figures on each side. The main focus of the gameplay and even some of its planned organized play is not on competition, but instead on moving a narrative forward. And from what I've been hearing from people who actually played this game at Adepticon, it's a ton of fun, easy to learn, but has a ton of potential depth and strategy potential if that's your thing. The models for this game are in a 35mm heroic scale, produced in-house at Broken Anvil in the extremely durable and high detail material CO Cast Hard. However, just in case you were wondering, the models I'm painting today are actually pre-production figures. They're 3D printed, so if you see any layer lines on the models I'm painting today, those will not be present in the final CO Cast models. If you're interested in seeing how some of the actual models look and perform when you put paint on them, feel free to check out my previous Rivenstone video where I go more in depth on that subject. This game is on Kickstarter right now for a few more days, and there's just a ton of incentives to back this early ahead of time if you want to, but keep in mind this will also be a regular retail release game that will be supported with more and more miniatures, organized play, and just a ton of other stuff from what it sounds like. As I've said many times before, I'm super excited about this game and I'm going to be painting up as much of it as I possibly can on this channel. So if this sounds like your thing, why not go and check out the Kickstarter as well as all of the lore and gameplay articles that you could ever want at rivenstonegame.com. And with our ad spot out of the way, let's get back to painting. So our second leather color is actually more of a glaze, and it's a 50-50 mix of Cavalry Brown and Black Templar. The The Black Templar has the effect of darkening as well as thinning down the cavalry brown, which we can now apply as a sort of glaze onto all the leather parts of the figures. And as I'm applying this, you can see why I left some of the leather trim untouched at a previous step. Because now when we're glazing over all the leather parts, it looks like a slightly different color when we apply this glaze. We can also apply more or less of this paint to different areas of the model to achieve slightly different colors of leather if we like. And I've also chosen this color as the base tone for the decorative hairpiece on the patrol runner's helmet. At this point, there is only one step left to do to finish up painting the base tones on these models, and that is the skin on the faces of the models. Painting human skin can be as easy or as complicated as you like, and you can check out my full video on the subject down below if you'd like some tips on how to approach it in depth. But for today, I'm trying to keep it simple, and I'm just going to base coat all of the skin with some Dalerani fluorescent pink ink, and once that's dry, I applied a single base coat color to the skin for each model. And to get some variety in the skin tones, the three colors that I chose for these three models were Gore-Grunt of Fur for the model with the darkest skin tone, a 50-50 mix of Gore-Grunt of Fur and Parasite Brown for a medium skin tone, and Skeleton Horde for the lightest skin tone. You can see that these base coats, in combination with the warmth from the fluorescent pink undertone, do a lot to give our skin tones some built-in shadows and highlights. And we can come back to the skin tones at a later date to add even more details if we like. But for now, I'm just going to give the base of the models a heavy dry brush in Vallejo Model Color Buff, followed up by a lighter dry brush in Vallejo Model Color Pale Sand. Make sure the bases are rimmed in black, and then I'm ready to call these models battlefield ready. But of course I don't want to stop there, and I think there's all kinds of other little touches we could add to these figures if we want to make them really shine on the battlefield. And the first thing I think could use just a little bit more love and attention are the highlights on the cloth. I was considering using the same method here that I used on my Rivenstone Oryx models, but after thinking about it, I wanted to go for a more refined, clean look to the cloth on these models, so I thought I would do some simple layering and highlighting of the cloth parts on these models. And to start out, I mixed in a tiny amount of pale sand with some of our original Pterodon turquoise color, until we achieve a color that is just a shade lighter than our base tone. After wiping the majority of this paint off on a paper towel, we can then start highlighting the cloth parts on the model, adding just a bit of this paint to any of the parts of the cloth that would catch the light. You can see here that the contrast paints have already given us a good foundation to work from, so we don't need to do too much layering on the cloth, but I find this helps to make the models look a little bit more clean, crisp, and finished. After we're done with our first layer, we can add just a tiny bit more pale sand to our mixture, and then add another round of highlights to the figure, taking care to leave lots of the original color intact, and again, just punching up any parts of the cloth that we really want to stand out. Finally, by adding just a tiny bit more pale sand to the mixture, we can get a very bright color that we can use to highlight just the edges of the cloth and maybe one or two other raised portions that we think might need it. After this, I perform these exact same layering steps on the undersuit of the models, adding more and more bits of pale sand to our mixture of Achelian green and Griff Charger gray, which was our base color for these parts of the model, and working up the highlights in the same way. And after this is done, we can then add some highlights to the leather parts of the model by using our initial leather color Parasite Brown, just unthinned this time. I actually didn't go too far with the leather highlights on these models, and I just did a single layer of highlights to punch up any areas I thought could use it. But you could also do the same thing here that I just did to the cloth if you wanted to, and mix in successive amounts of pale sand if you'd like your leather to have a more reflective look. Next up, we're going to do some cleanup and highlights on the white armor plates. And we're actually going to be using Seafoam Green for this. And I know this is sort of unconventional, but trust me, using a cool bright color like this is going to do more to make our armor look like white plates of armor than any actual white paint would do in this case. And if you're wondering how I got this Seafoam Green color, I just used a single drop of Pterodon turquoise, mixed with a bunch of pale sand to get a color that looks like this. Using our detail brush with a sharp point, I used this paint to both highlight any of the parts of the armor that I thought would catch the light, as well as to clean up any areas where the black paint from the trim might have spilled over just a bit too much. And you can pretty easily see what I mean when I say that this color looks more white than actual white when applied as a highlight. My personal theory as to why this looks good is that it gives the impression that the white armor is reflecting a tiny bit of the blue of the sky. But that's just speculation on my part. I don't know why this looks good, I just know that I like the way it looks. This color also works super well for highlighting any of the other metallic parts on the figure, and by using the same color for all of our armor highlights, I find it helps make all of the metal look more like metal, as anything shiny would be reflecting that same light from the sky. The contrast paint has already provided a solid foundation of non-metallic metal for the weapons, but if we want to, we can add more highlights at this stage to those parts using this same color as well. And we can even use this color to edge highlight the black armor trim by wiping off the majority of the paint on a paper towel and just softly running our brushes over the edge of the raised parts of the armor trim. After this, I then did some panel lining with black Templar to help the deepest creases of the figure look a little bit more like they're in shadow. And finally, to finish up the figures, I wanted to add just one more accent color, fluorescent pink. And instead of having this color present on the model itself, I just wanted to imply that some sort of a faint pink glow is reflecting on this figure, either from a nearby Rivenstone deposit, or perhaps from one of the other bright pink light sources present in the effects of this army. So the way I did this was to just pick out some random parts of the figure that I thought might catch this pink light, and applied a small amount of my favorite Dalerani fluorescent pink ink onto it, and in most cases I chose to place the pink on this model in places that might give the impression that the pink light is reflecting upwards, so as to not interfere too much with the white highlights from the light source of the sky. You can add as little or as much of this pink to your models as you like. I just thought it added a little bit of life to this otherwise very monochromatic color scheme. Once that's done, I added a little bit of foliage to the figures like I've been doing with all of my Rivenstone figures, and once again, if you want to see exactly how I do this, there's a video down in the description talking about all of the basing that I do for these figures. And once we've done that, our Rivenstone Shattered Empire figures are finally complete. I hope you enjoyed this very long and in-depth painting guide for a set of figures that are not even in stores yet. My hope for you is that you use these techniques on all sorts of other models. You could pretty much apply this exact scheme to any models with armor and some cloth bits, or that you are watching this in 2023 and you've just gotten all of your Shattered Empire figures in from the Kickstarter and you're getting ready to paint them. So if that's the case, you're watching when you got your Shattered Empire figures, make sure to leave me a comment down below, because that would be my dream, that someone's actually going to be using this to paint those figures. As always, thank you to all of our lovely patrons for supporting this channel. Thank you to Rivenstone for sponsoring this video and sending me all of these lovely figures to paint. And I will see you in the next video.